Hello everyone, welcome to this new course where we will be painting a portrait in grisaille. A grisaille is basically making a monochromatic painting in black, white and raw umber. We will cover all the basics that is required to paint a portrait in grisaille. So let's start talking about the materials first. In terms of the materials, what I have here is first is a palette. This is a nice wooden palette, and you can see that the palette is tiny bit grayed out. That's because before I started using this palette, what I did was I applied a few coats of oil mixed with black and white to gray it down tiny bit. In the beginning, when the palette came straight from the box, it was quite saturated, so I grayed it down because it's easier to work on a palette that is slightly grayer and judge what your values and color relationships are going to be. So that is the primary reason why I grayed down this palette. In terms of the paint, I'm using Winsor Newton paints, and we have ivory black, raw umber and titanium white. I also have a lead white. So there's a big difference between using titanium white and lead white. We will get into that when we talk about mixing our values, but that is the only paints that is going to be required for this course. Raw umber, ivory black and a titanium white. In terms of the surface that we're going to be working on, I'm using panel, a wood panel. This is a birch wood panel that I've prepared it with 2 layers of acrylic gesso and then 2 layers of an oil ground on top. I'm just using Winsor Newton acrylic gesso and Winsor Newton oil ground to prepare it. Especially with the oil ground, you have to prepare in advance. You have to wait 1 day in between each coat, and then you have to wait 3 to 5 days before you can start painting on the panel so that it's completely dry. I'm also sanding in between tiny bit the layers. I'm using a 220 grit sandpaper to create some tooth in my panel, but very lightly sanding it. You can use a panel, or you can also use linen, oil primed linen canvas. These are my go-to preferences for when I'm painting in oil. So that's it for this materials. Let's get started. Before we begin with the next layer in our underpainting process, I want to talk tiny bit about how to mix your values for painting, and also the difference between using lead white and titanium white, and why we are using raw umber in this grisaille painting. And we can see already how much there is a difference between using lead white and titanium white. This is almost making a very cool blue mixture, whereas this is making a much warmer mixture in relationship. And then you can try to do the same thing with raw umber and white and see how that works. The grisaille painting is where we are trying to create a neutral painting. We're not trying to create something that is cool or something that is warm. So we have to make a mixture that is in between a cool and a warm. So let's see what happens when we mix our raw umber with lead white, and you'll see that when I place these two close to one another, one looks quite brown and the other one looks quite blue, right? But in grisaille we want to create something that is in between these two for it to be a proper grisaille monochromatic painting. So that's why we have white, black and raw umber, and we're not using white and black only or white and raw umber only. If we used only white and raw umber for this monochromatic painting, it wouldn't be called a grisaille, it would be called a brunelli. Grisaille means grace, neutral grace, that's what we're working with. And see how much there is a difference between this warm and this almost looks bluish. Now let's see what happens when we mix both black raw umber and white. And you can see now this mixture that I have here is what we call a neutral value. So those are the main differences between using titanium white, lead white, and also why we use raw umber as a mixture. What you can also do is, when before you start mixing your values, just to practice the idea of mixing values, you can also make a chart with three rows three rows and 6 columns, where you have one row with black and white only, one row with um, raw umber and white only, and in between them you can have black, raw umber plus white to make a neutral mixture of 6 values going from the darkest dark to the lightest light. Now what we'll do is we'll mix these 6 values going from darkest dark to lightest light, but I'm going to show you only how to mix the neutral range, and the other ones are quite easy to handle. It's almost a mid-tone value, so I'm going to keep that as a reference. For the darkest dark, we're going to be using roughly 50% raw umber and 50% black. So that's how I would organize my palette every day, from the lightest value to the darkest value, making sure everything is neutral. For colors as well, I organize it in terms of value, going from lightest value to the darkest value.